Hi, everyone. This is Talkback. It's March 17th, 2021. Are we coming out of the dark days of last year? I hope so. We have hope here. We have Emma Palzure with us. She's a frequent guest because Emma stands for healing through the arts, theater for social change. The most important things in life are feeling, listening, appreciating, understanding, and we can only get that if we think poetry, art, performance are important in life. And that's what Emma stands for. And she's healed lots of people with all her wonderful performances and her work over the years. So it's great to have you again. Hi, Emma.
Hi, glad to be back.
Okay. And today it's special because it's Women's History Month that we're celebrating in March. And over your career, you've portrayed lots of different women. But before we get to that, tell us about why healing through the arts is important and why that has really been the hallmark of just your career and your life in general and the things that you've done.
Well, I was when I was living in New York to pursue acting. I was in what was called a career intensive class, and we did an exercise on purpose. And the business of show business can be pretty shallow if it's all just about getting the next job. And it occurred, through that exercise, I thought, no, I want people to feel better when they leave the theater than when they arrived, and if we're creating theater or TV or film for that matter, and not not having a greater impact than and entertainment in and of itself, having a good laugh is healing, and sometimes a play moves us to cry or to think about something in a new perspective that we never had before, or to be empathetic to another perspective that maybe you feel because of a character on stage. So yeah, I just want people to feel better when they leave the theater than when they walked in.
All right. Well, you and I kind of met each other when we were both working with Safe Futures, and we lived through experiences with people that were not pleasant, that were tragic in many ways. But we tried through your work to uplift their spirits. And one of the things that we did fighting domestic violence was use your philosophy of theater for social change. And you directed a wonderful play that exhibited and gave examples of people going through the process of living with domestic violence. Talk about that, the Theater for Social Change, which I think you originated in New York. Is that true?
Yeah, I was lucky to work for a company called Plays for Living, which sadly closed a couple years ago, but they were founded during World War II by several Broadway actresses, including Catherine Cornell and Ethel Barrymore, to use theater for social change, originally to raise money for war bonds. And after the war, they did plays about alcoholism and divorce when those were taboo subjects. And it just kept going over the years. And in the 90s, I guess the early 90s, they premiered a play called Rule of Thumb, which was, the purpose of it was really to break the myths of domestic violence, and did that through the story of two women who appear to be polar opposites, but they meet while both are in court for the same reason, to file for a restraining order. And then through flashbacks, I apologize for that noise. I can't reach that phone. Their stories unravel through flashbacks, and we see what is going on in their homes, how they're treated in the workplace when they're not fully functioning because of what they're going through, what they went through when seeking help from a friend who's a lawyer. So kind of all the myths around what a victim is experiencing, and she would get help if it was really bad.
Right.
And we see both sides of that story through the play. And it really, the Plays for Living plays are half-hour dramas that are open-ended to set up the discussion afterwards. So we had some great times presenting that play. We presented it at the Navy for all the, it was like 1,200 cadets who really were anxious to talk about the issues. And there were some big news stories around the time that we presented it, and just really provides that format for people to openly ask the questions and really see a different side to a story than they might be aware of, from a public perspective.
And there's so much more you can gather through feeling, understanding, that you can through the portrayal in a play than you can just by reading some words on the page. I think that was so wonderful about it. It's like, wow, your eyes are open in just a half hour. You could be reading 20 books for days and days and not get the same ideas from it. So it's very, very powerful. And then to add to that in your career, you're now, in addition to all your work with your grants that we're going to talk about, your performance art, we're going to talk about your work now as the Associate Director of Art Reach. Tell us about that program, because that, again, is completely, again, your vision of healing through the arts.
Yeah, and I feel so lucky and blessed to be a part of the Art Reach team. Art Reach is based in Norwich, and it's been around since 1985, most known for its Second Step Players sketch comedy troupe. Art Reach provides all manner of arts programs to adults living with mental illness. And that's theater programs, which I'm heavily involved in, visual arts, music, comedy. In January, we premiered a sketch comedy show virtually called Stir Crazy, Comedy from the Pandemic. And we had 7 sketches kind of with our shared experiences of what we've been through this past year. And that is available on the videos on Art Reach's Facebook page, which is at Art Reach Heals. And so we just had a great experience putting that together. And that was a perfect example because it was so healing for everybody who participated, all our cast members, to have that project to focus on, especially over like November, December, beginning of January, when things were kind of dark and bleak and no end in sight at that time. So, to have, work to focus on and have a weekly rehearsal time for your sketch that you were responsible for showing up for was really powerful for people. And then to be able to watch it in a, the different experience with a virtual show was, everybody was able to watch it. We pre-recorded some segments and did some segments live. So the cast was really able to come together and watch it and share their joy and having done it and watch it together, which was a cool experience too.
Great. Yeah. And so now, in addition to that, you also have your Be Well Productions, and through that, you are using your performance art to celebrate women and to do all kinds of projects that are important to the history of women in our culture. So tell us about the Be Well Productions and your recent grant that you've received to do more work.
I started Be Well Productions in 1989, and it was a case of, I'd been in New York a couple of years, and I had worked solid for a couple of years, in and out of town, and hit my first dry spell, and it was really unhealthy for me. I really realized how challenging that was, and that I needed to take control over something, and my ability to work did not. I needed to find a way to do it to not be reliant on other people casting me. And a friend of mine suggested I read the play The Belle of Amherst by William Luce, which was about the life of Emily Dickinson and had been on Broadway and won a Tony Award. And I fell in love with that play. and with Emily Dickinson, who I hadn't known much about previously, except for the standard poems that you learn in high school. And I produced it. And I thought I would produce it for a couple months, get a job, and, I could do it in between jobs if I wanted to. And I never thought it would bring me the wealth of experiences that it did, from traveling to schools and theaters across the country and performing in libraries and senior centers and historical societies, and having control over earning a living as an artist. And then after performing The Belle of Amherst, I started to apply for grants and create other shows. After performing in that show, I decided to take on writing my own shows. Although I did a solo improv show in between there, which was a completely crazy idea. I got funding for it. It was called ICU Improv Comedy Unit, because laughter is the best medicine. And I had the audience give me a who, what, where, and I would improvise a monologue. I had some character monologues I did to kick the show off. I had a trunk of costume pieces, and I had a piano player. So a key aspect of that was having a piano player, improv music and fill in time while I was. So that was a really experimental thing to do, but a lot of fun. And then I started to write about other historical women. And kind of behind all of that is the reality that there weren't and aren't good roles for women. If you're not an ingenue, if you're not the leading lady, there aren't the same opportunities in theater and film and TV. And when I started producing my own work, I discovered a lot of other women were doing the same thing for the same reasons. They needed to be able to control working, have some control over whether they were working, and they needed to create roles that they could be passionate about and care about. And, auditioning for commercials in the early 90s, it was like, why would you do this? So I was able to band together with a lot of other women doing solo theater and create a festival to really even, empower us as a group to get more publicity, to financially be able to do it, and create a community amongst ourselves as we
Right.
were, getting our work out there. So. And then realizing that, they're just these stories of women just aren't being told. We've seen a lot of movement in the last decade and more in the last couple of years, but there's so many stories of women that we aren't taught in history, or we're taught from a very limited perspective. And really sharing those full stories. The stories that we tell as a society are what that's what our society becomes about. And we're in a really important time right now of the door is opening to telling stories about people of color, telling stories about women that we haven't been taught. And those are our stories. And it's important that we tell them.
Okay. So we're going to talk about four of the iconic women that you have portrayed, and we'll show some of your photos of that as well. But tell us about the most recent surprise grant that you got to do more work on a new project. Talk about that.
Yeah. So, lemons out of lemonade, partly because of COVID, there's been more funding for individual artists. And I've had a couple grants that have allowed me to produce my shows virtually. But I'm really honored to have been named a 2021 Artist Fellow and to receive that Artist Fellowship Award from the Connecticut Office of the Arts and the Department of Economic and Community Development, which is a great honor to receive that award, which will enable me to start work on a new piece. So,
Great.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about your new research, or do you want to wait for us to learn about it?
We'll save it for later. We'll save it.
All right. So we're going to talk about now, because in honor of Women's History Month, we're going to talk about four of the iconic women that you have portrayed. who maybe we wouldn't know as much about them were it not for your work and your research, especially the first one, Victoria Woodhull, who many people probably have no idea of who she is, and the fact that she ran for president of the United States in 1972, and she actually made it on ballots across the country and at a political party called the Equal Rights Party. So give us a little bit about Victoria Woodhull.
Yes, and it was 1872. You just said 1972.
Did I say 1970? Of course I meant 1872. Oh, gosh.
Yeah, so Victoria Woodhull grew up out of nothing in rural Ohio, not educated, by all accounts from a very abusive home, so much so that she, at the age of 14, married her doctor and ran away, who also was alcoholic and abusive. But that really gave her a grounding and passion for helping women and for all the social ills that really kept women oppressed and kept women down. And phenomenal that you can read her speeches today. One, that she wrote these speeches with the limited education that she had. She had to really have been brilliant. And two, when you read her speeches, we're still fighting the same battles. She talked about equal pay for equal work. She talked about abuse and not tolerating marital abuse, or what we would call domestic violence today, that women needed to own property because otherwise they were forced to marry and forced to be in these relationships. She talked about how many rapes took place under the marriage license, nightly. And so just amazingly forward thinking. And when you read about her today, you go, wow, she was doing that in 1872. And she just had this drive, she was pretty much on her own. And even she was the first woman. I mean, she's got a lot of firsts. She opened a stock brokerage on Wall Street. She ran her own newspaper. She also was the first woman to address Congress in 1870. And she made a case for why women already had the right to vote, that the Constitution nowhere specified gender as to rights, and that therefore women already had the right to vote. And she was in no way affiliated with the national suffrage movement at that time, but Susan B. Anthony and Isabella Beecher Hooker were in the audience when she gave that congressional address, and immediately invited her to come speak to their, they were having a convention in Washington, D.C. starting that same week. And then things just really snowballed from there.
Right. Of course, she did. Of course, she didn't win. And of course, just to put her in context, 1872, that's only a few years after the Civil War, after the assassination of Lincoln, the failed presidency of Johnson, and then she was beaten by Ulysses S. Grant, who was going into his second term as president of the United States. But nevertheless, that was an unbelievable statement. But also, Emma, in addition to her foresight about some of these issues, she also had a little bit of an unusual character in some other areas of life, right? She was a little offbeat in certain things.
Yeah, her platform, she advocated for free love, which was kind of based on this whole idea that if women had to get married to have property, to have any kind of financial security, children were being born and raised in an unhealthy situation. And, she believed people naturally loved people for as long, loved their partner for as long as they loved them. And if it was time to move on, then it was time to move on. So that was, she wasn't the only person advocating free love, but it was controversial in many circles. It's also the reason why Henry Ward Beecher went through his famous adultery trial, because he was quite known to have several mistresses, even though he was a prominent preacher, and she wanted his support. And he kind of said, "Are you crazy? I'm a preacher. I can't I can't get up there and advocate your free love, campaign. And she struggled over whether or not to reveal what she knew about his personal relationships. And when she did, it meant that he had to go to trial. It also meant that she ended up in jail. So she was in jail on Election Day 1872 for accusing, she in her newspaper published the word adultery, which was enough ground for her to go to jail under the Comstock law. But interestingly, and I only learned this recently, Susan B. Anthony believed in Victoria Woodhull's case that women already had the right to vote so strongly that Susan B. Anthony voted in 1872 and was arrested. And she was encouraging she was encouraging women to vote in that election, get arrested, and then have your attorney make Victoria's case.
Right.
Like, she started this whole campaign that women should go vote and get arrested, and we would be defended with Victoria's case, and we would get the vote.
Well, that's great, because I knew the story of Susan B. Anthony attempting to vote and getting arrested. I didn't know that she got her inspiration from Victoria Woodhull, which is another fascinating thing.
I didn't, and it's not taught about, right? It's not, I just read that in a book that just came out. So it's all kind of accredited to Susan B. Anthony and not at all to Victoria Woodhull. And the ground she really broke.
That's terrific. Yeah. All right, so she's one of you portray her. I've seen you in your shows doing that. Terrific. We'll show some photos of that. Let's go on to the next iconic woman. Is it really true that Abraham Lincoln said to Harriet Beecher Stowe, "So you're the little woman that caused this great big war"? Is that a true story? It's
believed to be true, but it's not documented anywhere. So as would have been proper at the time, Mary Todd Lincoln invited Harriet Beecher Stowe to the White House to meet Abraham Lincoln, because he really wanted Harriet Beecher Stowe's advice on emancipation. And the only documentation about it, when I was doing my research, this is like the most disappointing thing you can ever find. The letters that they wrote home, she went with her sister and her daughters, her twin daughters went with her on this trip to Washington. And they wrote home that we had the most funny interview. It was the most droll time. We'll tell you all about it when we get home. So they didn't write it in a letter.
I know. Well, wouldn't you give anything, Emma, if all of those historical women that you research, if they only had text and Twitter and internet and smartphones, I mean, how much more we would be learning. We might be learning about personal things that would harm our opinion of them too. Who knows, right? That's terrific. But of course, that comment relates to the book that she wrote that became an absolute sensation. And so tell us about who was she and what gave her the background, the gumption to write this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that became a sensation, that influenced the world.
Yeah. What interests me about Stowe is, other than she truly was a 19th century working mother, she was writing books to make money while she was raising 7 children. And her family really relied on that income. But on the other hand, she came from this prominent family of preachers, and she didn't have that option to give sermons, right? So in a way, writing could be her voice as far as that was concerned. But she will also, there's this dichotomy of, well, I write for the money and I am guided by a higher power to tell these stories, and to me that fascinates me about her, because there's just this practical side. And then, and sometimes she'd say, well, Uncle Tom's Cabin wrote itself. It just went through me. And I'm also fascinated that it was published 10 years before the start of the Civil War. And we often don't realize that. today, you know, that it kicked off a national dialogue 10 years before the start of the war around abolition and slavery. And she was greatly accused as a white woman from the North. What do you know about slavery? What do you understand about the economics of it? You have no personal experience. But that caused her, the year after Uncle Tom's Cabin was published, to publish a book called A Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin, where she documented everything she had read, seen, heard, experienced personally of having to do with slavery. So she felt very personally attacked when, you know, particularly Southerners would say, well, she had no idea what she was talking about when she wrote this book, that the book doesn't portray slavery accurately, which of course was not true. But she lived in Cincinnati in that before writing the book. The Beechers all had moved to Cincinnati, where her father was teaching at Lane Seminary. And they were, you know, they lived on the Kentucky River, and they saw slaves trying to escape. They knew what was happening to people. She and her sister were invited to visit a plantation in Kentucky. And as it was the first time when they were supposed to like stay for a week, and they only stayed a couple days because they realized that mulatto children were the product of the master and a mother who was a slave. Right. That this was condoned, not only condoned adultery, but rape. Yeah. Right. And so in a way, that's very forward thinking. That's not what we were taught. We're only kind of hearing those, you know, having those realizations ourselves recently. But that so angered them that they couldn't stay at the plantation. They realized, you know, and from their perspective, a lot of it had to do with their Christian upbringing, that, you know, that slavery was just unchristian from their perspective, that you didn't treat another human being in any of the ways that slaves were treated. And then to throw on top of that masters were creating more property through adultery and rape, right, was just not tolerable.
Was she involved in the abolitionist movement itself, other than the writing of that book?
It's another dichotomy, because she did not consider herself an abolitionist. She considered herself a good Christian, right? However, she did things like, you know, she went to Massachusetts to see the famed regiment that the movie was made about with Matthew Broderick. She went to Massachusetts to watch them march off to the Civil War. She was in Boston on New Year's Eve when emancipation was going to go into effect at midnight. So she was very involved in the abolitionist movement, but she would not say, oh, I'm an abolitionist, right?
Okay. So that's Harriet Beecher Stowe. Before we move on to the next person, anything else that's really struck you about her that you want to tell us?
Well, I have, I'm producing the play virtually on March 27th. I'll be doing a live stream performance with some rewrites to the script. So it's now called Aunt Hattie's House Reconstructed, to really reflect some of our more current, I've been doing this play for 20 years. So there were some language I really wanted to update, and things that I used to save for discussion, like that story about visiting the plantation, that I feel now is important to include in the performance. So that's going to be live streamed on March 27th. Yeah. And really, it's just looking at her as a working mother, as opposed to this, you know, we've put her in this box as this New England prominent, you know, that kind of very New England white waspy kind of box, you know, with these perfect people, like these privileged people. And she was, you know, she was like a lot of us, trying to write and earn a living and having kids. And some days they were sick and she couldn't work, and, you know.
Right.
trying to make ends meet, and moving around and taking in boarders, and and to me that humanizes her in a way that she's
Yeah.
not portrayed in our history books.
Yeah. And of course, what you're saying about visiting the plantation and learning about what the slave owners did, of course, it resonates with now all of the looking back in history to our founders, our Thomas Jeffersons and others who had slaves, who had relationships with slaves, and huge families that arose from those relationships. So all of that brings to mind how do you evaluate our history and what happened? How do you put everything in context?
Yeah.
Very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So let's move on to Emily Dickinson, the Belle of Amherst, Massachusetts. And I've been doing some research. I'm going to have a program again celebrating Women's History Month, where a professor is going to talk about Black and white women abolitionists. And I understand that Emily Dickinson's father was in the abolitionist movement.
Well, it's all part of that Massachusetts. They weren't part of the whole transcendentalist kind of thing, but they were
Right.
neighboring of it. And her father was a congressman.
Right. So what is the age, what is the era of Emily Dickinson?
She was born in 1830 and lived to 1886. So similar time period, like overlapping.
Right.
Of course, her one phenomena is, that she rarely left her home once she was an adult and wore white. And again, in history, that's been portrayed in this, really demeaning to women way, right? Like, oh, well, she always wanted to get married, or, well, she was a recluse and mentally ill. And I really see her as somebody who probably was a mystic, but as an artist, did what she needed to do to pursue her art, which she knew was her purpose in life. By not marrying, by not, and she had the ability and the privilege to do this, by not having to get married to support herself, to have financial security, by not getting involved in society at that time. That gave her the freedom to be creative and to write this body of work that if she was married and having kids, as we can speak from her own experience, like,
right.
Who could have written 3,000 poems and 2,000 letters doing all that?
Right. Right.
I feel like she took care of herself in a way that wasn't always easy. I mean, there was a lot of pain and struggle with it.
Yeah.
But she stayed true to her purpose in life.
Right. So when you're doing the Belle of Amherst and you're performing, doing her, and she's not going anywhere, so it's has to be a very thoughtful, very poetic piece, because there's not a lot of action in her life, right? Based on what she did.
There was, because of how she saw the world.
Sure.
I mean, on another level, she didn't feel she needed to go anywhere because she had her imagination. Right. And she did, in her younger life, she had experiences that were very formative. Going to Mount Holyoke College during a time of really religious fervor that she didn't agree with. She did travel to Washington with her sister when their father was a congressman. She had experiences to draw on, but she had imagination and emotion. I think in my mind, she felt emotion so purely and strongly that, as a poet, that gives you a lifetime of things to write about.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So what do you have? Emily Dickinson poem, and do you remember a few lines of it?
Well, one of my favorites is that's about not participating in society. Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home. with a bobolink for a chorister and an orchard for a dome. Some keep the Sabbath in surplice. I just wear my wings, and instead of tolling the bell for church, our little sextant sings. God preaches, a noted clergyman, and the sermon is never long. So instead of getting to heaven at last, I'm going all along.
Oh, that's great. Lovely.
Yeah, and it also speaks to her ability to see God in nature and not in the constraints of what society said God was at that time. Showing up at church on Sunday morning in your best clothes, right? So, yeah.
Great. Anything else you want to share with us about Emily before we move on to the next one?
No, I think that covers it.
Okay. And then finally, in one more contemporary vein, we'll show the wonderful image of you portraying Gilda Radner, who I think many of us loved as a comedian who we lost way too soon to cancer. That was really sad. Talk about Gilda Radner, why you chose her.
Yeah, well, having been in high school in the early 80s, she was a big influence on me. My friends and I would watch Saturday Night Live every Saturday, stay up late, and then, mimic everything at school during the week. And then after, her diagnosis of ovarian cancer and her subsequent death, I was just starting kind of on this solo show journey. And I thought she really is, her message was about laughter as a medicine. And, her struggle to come to terms with, having to face the thing that she feared the most, cancer, while having this identity as a comedian. Like, how do you reconcile those two? So my play is set in the afterlife, and she is called upon to put on a comedy show, and she walks out on stage and says, I don't know. I don't know if I'm still funny because I died of cancer. And she's kind of taken on this journey reflecting back on her life, and her characters help her find those moments of humor in what she went through. So it's a funny piece. It's poignant. It's, takes us on that journey with her and her realization how laughter, is healing, and, accepting what life gives you with humor and positive energy is important.
What were some of the characters that she created? Can you give us an example?
Yeah, and what was interesting as I was developing the play, I decided that there was a character to represent the 7 stages of, acceptance of grief. And so there was Candy Slice, her punk rock character, was that kind of anger. Judy Miller, her little girl character, her little brownie Girl Scout character, with kind of Emily Latella was denial, right? So they're kind of like Rosanna Dana was bargaining, so they each kind of came out at their stage to kind of say, hey, but what about what about this? So Rosanna Dana, Emily Latella, Judy Miller, Candy Slice, I'm forgetting one, Lisa Loopner, so
Can you give us a few lines of one of her iconic characters she created?
Well, Emily Latella always said, so in the play, Emily Latella thinks she's gotten Bavarian cancer, and she can't drive a BMW or have a Bavarian cream. So, of course, at the end, she goes, oh, never mind.
Never mind, right? Never mind. That was one of her, yeah. She's missed, but it's important to realize that even though she's gone quite a number of years now, so many people still remember her and still are thrilled by what she did.
Yeah, and even younger generations because of, well, TV shows that are streamed and that her work really does live on.
Right.
And I will say it's extremely different to play a character that people know so intimately in a way that they don't know someone who was just photographs and text and books, right? That somebody who is on our TV screens and in our living rooms, I realize people have a very different relationship with that person than they do with some of these other historical characters that we never saw live on video or heard their voices.
Yeah, but that gives you a lot of artistic freedom to explore different interpretations as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's turn now to some of your album of photos from these iconic women. Can you see this?
Yeah, let's see.
Can you see this?
We're seeing a quote.
Yes.
Yeah.
Most things that I picked out this quote because I think it relates to you, Emma. You didn't know about it. Most things that I've had in life have been destroyed, stolen, lost, or taken, but art and poetry shall be with me forever. Right?
Yeah.
Is that a theme that you think is true?
I do. I think when you create, you always have that. There was a point in my life, I don't know, I was in my 30s and I had friends who were getting married and having kids and buying houses. And I said to my mother, I said, well, what do I have? I just have a couple plays. And she said, but you will always have those plays.
Right.
Don't you talk like that? That you do. When you've created something, it doesn't always feel that way, but you always have that.
So that is the Woodhull Project, right?
Yeah. And we are live streaming. We're rebroadcasting the live stream of that play on Saturday, March 20th, this Saturday at 2 p.m. And you could find out about it on Facebook at Be Well Productions.
Oh, good.
Yeah. So people have a chance to watch it again, and we'll have a talk back.
And this is, again, this is Victoria. And when you designed the costumes for your portrayals, you did a lot of research, I'm sure, right?
Yeah. So Victoria was known for wearing purple, the white rose, always at her collar. And initially, I had done some work at Mystic Seaport, and I initially asked them if they had a dress I could borrow. And they were so excited because they knew, like, oh, we have several purple dresses. That would be fantastic. And then ultimately they allowed me to, they were going to be weeding out their costumes and offered for me to buy this costume, which I just love. Yeah.
Now here she is again. What's the symbol behind her? What's the importance of that?
That is the Trinity, and it's from a lecture she gave where she says there is a Trinity in all things. And she talks about the religious, political, and social trinities that make up the triunity of humanity.
Right.
So it's talking about humanity and our responsibility politically, socially, and religiously, if that's where you're coming from, to do things right.
Okay. Now, this particular baton, what was that? A baton she was holding?
That's a cane. That's actually, she's portraying her father who took her and her sister on medicine shows. And, well, they were both known to be clairvoyant. So he would have his daughters for $1 an hour in rooms with people that they can consult through their psychic abilities, but I'm sure there was more going on than that.
Right.
It's a little bit of a creepy scene.
Here she is.
Yeah.
Pontificating.
Yeah.
And yeah. Now, is she doing a prayer here, or is she?
She was known to go into trances while public speaking. So this is the end of one of her speeches, and she does go into a little bit of a trance and blesses the audience. I think that's the section where she's speaking at Cooper Union to 3,000 people. Wow. And hundreds were turned away in the pouring rain.
Wow.
Yeah.
Here she is again. You can see, yes, she's trance-like in that
Yeah.
portrayal.
So she was very charismatic in that way. And supposedly in some of her kind of lost years, she thought that she went out to San Francisco to the gold rush and was part of an acting troupe where she may have learned her presentation skills a little bit. But
Right. Now, is this in Congress? Is this her speech
Yeah.
before the Congress?
yeah, this is giving her speech to Congress,
Now,
making a case for why women had the right to vote.
yeah. So that's quite a feat to be invited to be a guest at the United States Congress.
Mm-hmm. And the
Yeah.
first woman ever to be in that position.
Wow.
Yeah.
And Susan B. Anthony was in the audience?
Yes, because she and Isabella Beecher Hooker were organizing the convention for the suffrage, for the National Suffrage Association, that was going to be that same week, January
Wow.
1870 in Washington, D.C. So, and they had never met before. They had never heard of Victoria. Yeah.
Wow.
So
And now what is she reading? The newspaper?
she
About?
is reading about what Mark Twain said about Henry Ward Beecher's scandal, where he said the silence of the Beechers is a lot more telling than the words of Woodhull.
How long did she spend in jail?
Just a couple weeks, long enough to keep her from being out on election day.
Wow.
So the Comstock law in and of itself is a fascinating thing to
Right.
because it was really about just bringing down people doing certain things in New York City. And
So you couldn't use certain language in the press. Is that it?
Yes. Right. So sending what was considered pornography through the mail, which
Right.
to read was considered pornography.
And what is the importance of this vehicle?
So later in her life, she moved to England. Her and her sister both moved to England. She remarried there and really ended her life living in a manor house. But she had this Mercedes car that she loved.
Oh, so Mercedes.
And she probably got the first speeding ticket.
They had speeding tickets back then, huh?
Well, the speed limit was only 25 miles an hour or something. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what is this?
Oh, that's the medicine show wagon. Her father, that's the backdrop for her father selling their wares. Yeah, that's one of her speeches where she makes a case for free love.
Right.
Yeah. And why society would benefit by free love and doing away with the marriage license.
She said she's spoken to 250,000 of people.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Now did she create this paper?
Yeah, she wrote the speech and she performed it. So that's in a book I have.
Yeah.
That's like a reproduction of the pamphlet.
Right.
So she would write speeches. They would get published in her newspaper. They would print them as pamphlets. She would tour the country speaking. So she kind of knew how to get a lot of mileage out of what she was writing and about. Yeah.
It's so interesting today when we have all of these very easy, immediate methods of contact, social media, internet, phones, to realize how wonderfully well they did with the just the newspapers, right, as a means of contact and connection.
Yeah.
And
this people, people didn't have other forms of entertainment. If somebody was speaking and it sounded, you'd go just to be entertained.
Right.
Yeah.
Thousands of people went to watch the Lincoln Douglas debates that went on for 2, 3, 4, 5 hours.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Now, what was the importance of this Broadway near Wall Street? Is this where she started the first stock exchange company for a woman?
Yeah. She had the first stock brokerage run by women. And of course, Wall Street was so male dominated at the time, they could not go out for lunch.
Wow.
They had a male with them. So one of their scandals was, they wanted to go to that famous steakhouse and they were turned away because they didn't have a male with them. So they took their carriage driver in with them, which was even more scandalous.
Did they get kicked out or were they served?
No, I think they were served, but it was written about in the newspapers, of course.
Right. And there she is again.
Yeah.
And
There's the real Victoria.
the real Victoria. So you did a good job of, let me go back. You did a good job of recreating her.
Yeah.
She looks very confident.
Yeah. And known enough that she was photographed by Matthew Brady.
Wow.
Yeah.
All right. Now, next, here we come to, is this it says volume 1. Is that the original first book that was published?
Yeah. So the story was first published as a serial in the National Era, which was the abolitionist newspaper. So she was writing one chapter at a time to be published in the newspaper. And then no sooner had it finished than she had an offer to publish it. But it was so long at that point. She thought it would be 5 installments when she first started it. And
Right.
it ran for 2 years. So that's almost 100.
Right. And you're right. It was 13 years before the Civil War. This is 1852.
Yeah. So it was a 2-volume book when it first came out.
Right. And then this is your poster, Aunt Hattie's House. Talk about that.
So this is for our live streaming the revised version of the play on Saturday, March 27th at 2 p.m. And we will also have a conversation after that production. So the play is set at her house, which is the image on the right. Not the house that currently stands, but down that same street, Forest Street in Hartford, near Mark Twain's house. She had built in the 1860s this house called Oakholm because she loved Hartford and wanted to come back there, and finally felt they had the money to do so, and designed and built the house all herself, paid for it all herself, and using principles that she and her sister Catherine published in a book called The American Woman's Home.
Mm-hmm.
That gave, a lot of, for example, the house is called Oakholm, and they built it from the oak trees that were on the property that were cut down and sawed and, used for the timber for the house. So that was one of their ideas.
Yeah. It's a little larger vision of it.
And you notice there's a cross over the annex of the house, which it's not a chapel, but just some, I'm sure that's in the work too, but plenty of light, having light, having air, having plants in your home for the health of your children, having an herb garden with medicinal and cooking herbs in it. So a lot of ideas about how to keep a home, very much along the lines of what Martha Stewart say, before her time. Yeah.
Here she is.
Yeah.
And who is this? Catherine Stowe. What's the connection there?
That's Catherine Stowe. That's Catherine Beecher. That's her sister, her older sister, who, a remarkable family, the Beechers, because out of the 4 women, there were like 11 kids. All the brothers, except for, I think one became a lawyer, but the rest were very prominent ministers like their father. And out of the 4 women, 3 of them were nationally prominent. Catherine in education, Isabella in women's suffrage, and Harriet for her work on abolition and as a writer. So Catherine was very forward-thinking in education. She had started the Hartford Female Seminary, where Harriet became a teacher when she was 15. But was part of reforming education at that time and educating girls. Right. In the early to mid 1800s.
And do you talk about her sister in your show?
Yes, I do. Catherine came and helped care for the family. Her siblings all had to come and help care for the family so she could keep writing Uncle Tom's Cabin because it had to get to the newspaper every week.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we don't appreciate how many novels actually started out as weekly serials in magazines or newspapers.
And what people don't realize is that, particularly after Uncle Tom's Cabin, prior to Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet was writing a lot for periodicals. The Atlantic Monthly, Godey's Lady's Book. Her stories were quite popular. After Uncle Tom's Cabin, she published at least one novel a year for like 16 years. And we have so little knowledge of like her writing outside of Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Wow. Have you read any of those, Emma?
I've read a fair number. And the other kind of notable thing is, we think of Mark Twain and Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer really capturing the language that people spoke, in their dialects. Stowe was doing that 20 years before. She had a real knack for kind of creating these local characters, whether they were Maine or Ohio or, the various places where they lived. She really captured how people spoke and really created these vivid images of people, which, if you pick up Uncle Tom's Cabin and start reading it, you're immediately like, wow, like you're taken in by the story.
Right.
And a lot of humor. We don't tend to think of her as humor, but a lot of her stories for the periodicals, quite funny and witty about, and particularly how she portrays people.
Right.
Yeah. Small town people,
All right.
And that's me as Emily Dickinson.
Beautiful.
And that's a reproduction of her dress that they have in Amherst.
That's beautiful. It's a beautiful photograph, and it's really nice. Really nice. Want to say anything else about her before we move on?
No, I do like that picture and that dress. I love that dress. It's, she was known for wearing white, but this dress that they have, and it was not on display for a little while because they had to have it like reproduced. And I had a costumer go up to Amherst with me, and we had an appointment to be able to view the dress and look at the details of it. It's really, we think of it kind of like a house coat today, it buttons down the front, but it's got such beautiful details. It's all pleated, it's trimmed in lace, it's, and she specified a pocket. Of course, that's one of the big gender divisions is women never get pockets. And she needed a pocket for a pencil and paper. So if she ever had an idea, she could write it down.
Right.
So that's one of the notable things about her dress.
Great. Okay. And finally, I think this is so terrific. I can't even recognize you in that. Whoops. I can't even recognize you in that. I have to go through the whole.
Oh, no, you can't go back.
No, I can't. It's the last slide. Now I did it again. Oh, I did it again. Oh, let me go back. This is funny. I apologize.
When you got to stay. Okay. There you go.
Oh, I missed it again. Well, you keep talking while I do this. Tell us all about Gilda Radner while I do this. I apologize. This is so silly.
Oh
God.
I still have that wig, and it.
All right, I think I got it now. Here she is.
Yeah. So the wig was very difficult to get a good photograph of it. So I went to a photographer just because the shadow from the hair.
Right, and the way you positioned,
soak up any light, so you really had to have it.
And you positioned your head down perfectly to get the whole flavor of the hairdo. Yeah,
yeah. So a lot of wigs in that show. So
that's terrific, and your makeup. I mean, I can't even recognize Emma in that photograph. That's
my weekend update jacket.
What is that? Your weekend update, and you got your your flower and it's really terrific. You're pointing. Who is that? Who is she talking about? Who is she portraying there?
She's describing having the test where the camera goes down your throat.
Do you want to give us a little bit of that? Do you want to give us a little bit?
Oh, I can't remember it, but as you know, it's always something.
It's always something. That's what you said. Yeah.
You know, I had such I had the most wonderful director for this show. A woman named Penny Hirsch in New York City, and she was a survivor of breast cancer. And I asked her on the off chance, I said, "Is there any, would you be any way interested in directing this show?" And she got very quiet, and she said, "When I was diagnosed, people said, 'Oh, you should paint and you should write.'" And she said, "I was done in a half hour." She said, "I'm a director and I'm going to direct this show." And she brought so much of her own experience to the show, and just wonderful physical comedy, that her spirit was really in it. And unfortunately, she lost her battles of breast cancer.
Oh my, what a sad story.
But she did say, "Well, I know my work. Most things I've directed ran for 2 weeks, 2 months, and you'll keep doing this show." So,
well,
yeah.
Do you have plans to do the show again in the future?
I'm not sure what to do with it. It's a very physical show. There's tap dancing, there's flying, there's jumping on the bed. So there's unlike my other shows, it really requires a set and sound cues, and I would like to publish it, and I need to just kind of deal with some rights issues. So,
okay.
Yeah. So I'd like to see it published, or have other performers do it, or whatever.
Right. All right. So we're back. Sorry I hope I didn't make everybody dizzy with that display.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Emma, for giving us your interpretations of 4 very iconic, important women as we celebrate Women's History Month, or like we're trying to say, Herstory Month, right?
Yeah.
You that expression. So as we end this interview today, and always great to chat with you, and come back again with your Art Reach people. I'd love to have some of their comedy skits, and we can put them on. That would be terrific.
Oh, we'd love that.
Give us some final thoughts about the importance of women in history and in the arts.
Oh, I think just that, we have to explore these. We're at a time in history where it's time to reevaluate what we've been taught and what we haven't been taught, and go out there and, read about people and learn about people who went before us, and dig deeper, because there's more stories there that we're not aware of.
All right. And just as a final pitch for your March 27th, what is the website that we go on to register for the event?
Yeah, they're listed on Eventbrite, but if you go to Facebook to Be Well Productions, they're in the events there, and other information will be on that.
Okay,
Facebook.
Great. That's coming up. All right. Well, it's wonderful to have you on, and we'll see you again soon. See you all next time on Talk Back. Bye.
Thanks, Sheila.
Bye.